Welcome to this journey through one of the most devastating acts of faith-based murder in American history. Tell us where you're watching from now, because this story will shake your understanding of religious devotion in a way few other accounts can. We're about to delve into a mystery that claimed 37 lives in a single evening, where a charismatic preacher defied all concepts of sacred duty and left a legacy so horrifying that small Kentucky community where it occurred changed its name to escape the shadow of what happened within its borders. It was the year 1897. The United States was transforming. Electricity was illuminating cities. Automobiles were beginning to appear on cobblestone streets, and the wounds of the Civil War were slowly, painfully healing. But in the remote valleys of southeastern Kentucky, in a region where the Appalachian mountains rose like ancient sentinels against the sky, time moved differently. Progress arrived late, if it arrived at all. In Henderson County, tucked between ridges where morning mist clung to the valleys like spectral fingers, the community of Redemption Hollow existed in near isolation. The town consisted of perhaps 200 souls, their lives dictated by the rhythm of seasons, the yield of rocky soil, and the word of God as interpreted by those deemed worthy to speak his name. The hollow itself was a geographical cradle, a valley carved by millennia of water and wind between two imposing mountain ranges. Pine and oak forests climbed the slopes in dense formations, their canopies so thick that even at midday the forest floor remained in perpetual twilight. A single dirt road wound through the settlement, connecting rough-hewn cabins and homesteads that seemed to grow organically from the land itself, structures of weathered wood and fieldstone that had housed generations. Water came from cold springs that burst from limestone outcroppings and from Redemption Creek, which ran swift and clear through the center of the hollow, its waters the color of amber where they passed over beds of smooth river stone. In spring, when mountain snowmelt swelled its banks, the creek became impassable, effectively cutting the hollow off from the outside world for weeks at a time. The people of Redemption Hollow were hardy, suspicious of outsiders, and deeply, profoundly devout. Religion wasn't merely practiced here. It was lived, breathed, woven into every aspect of existence. Sunday services weren't optional social gatherings but sacred obligations, and the preacher wasn't just a spiritual leader but the singular moral authority, the interpreter of divine will, bridge between the earthly and the eternal. For 7 years, that bridge had been a man named Elijah Cartwright. Reverend Cartwright had arrived in Redemption Hollow in the spring of 1890, appearing seemingly from nowhere on a morning when fog obscured the mountain passes. He was tall and lean, with intense dark eyes that seemed to look through a person rather than at them, and a voice that could shift from gentle whisper to thunderous proclamation in the span of a single sentence. He carried nothing but a worn leather Bible, a change of clothes, and a letter of recommendation from a Baptist congregation in Tennessee that no one bothered to verify. Within months, he had transformed the spiritual life of the hollow. His sermons were unlike anything the simple farming community had experienced. Where previous preachers had offered comfort and traditional interpretations of Scripture, Cartwright spoke of revelation, of direct communication with the divine, of visions that came to him in darkness of night, when the boundary between this world and the next grew thin. He preached of the end times approaching like a storm over distant mountains, visible to those with eyes to see, inevitable as winter. His congregation grew devoted, then obsessed, then dependent. Sarah McKinney, who would later survive the events of October 17, 1897, remembered the transformation in her testimony to authorities. He had a way of making you feel chosen, special, like you were part of something greater than yourself, greater than this hollow, greater than this world. When Reverend Cartwright looked at you, really looked at you, it was like being seen by God Himself. The church where Cartwright preached stood at the heart of Redemption Hollow, a simple white clapboard building with a steep roof and a modest steeple that pointed toward heaven like an accusing finger. Inside, rough wooden pews could accommodate perhaps 150 people, though on important Sundays the congregation spilled out onto the church grounds, standing in the dust and listening through open windows. It was humble, it was plain, it would become a tomb. The autumn of 1897 arrived with unusual intensity. September brought killing frosts that blackened gardens overnight, and October dawned cold and gray, with clouds that pressed down on the mountains like a suffocating blanket. The harvest had been poor, a summer drought followed by torrential rains that rotted crops in the fields. Families faced a difficult winter, their root cellars only partially filled, their anxiety mounting with each passing day. Reverend Cartwright's sermons grew darker. He spoke of tribulation, of testing, of the faithful being refined by fire. He quoted from Revelation with increasing frequency, his voice rising and falling in hypnotic rhythms that left his congregation both terrified and transfixed. He introduced a new element to his services, prophecies, declarations that he claimed came directly from divine sources, visions granted to him in the small cabin he occupied at the edge of town. "The Lord has shown me what's coming," he proclaimed from the pulpit one Sunday in early October, his knuckles white as he gripped the lectern. "He has revealed the trials that await the unfaithful, the suffering reserved for those who doubt, who question, who turn away from His word. But He has also shown me the reward, the glory that awaits those who prove their devotion absolute." What did that mean? The congregation didn't know, but they trusted. They believed. They should have questioned. On October 10th, Cartwright announced something unprecedented, a special service to be held the following Sunday evening. Not a regular Sabbath gathering, but what he called a covenant meal, a sacred communion that would bind the faithful together in preparation for trials he claimed were imminent. Every member of the congregation was expected to attend, required to attend. This wasn't merely worship. This was, in his words, a sealing of souls. The announcement sent ripples through the hollow. A special service was unusual, but not unheard of. What raised eyebrows was Cartwright's insistence that the meal would be provided entirely by him, prepared. He said, according to instructions he'd received in a vision. No one was to bring food. No one was to eat beforehand. They were to arrive hungry, ready to partake of what he would offer. Some members of the congregation felt uneasy. Thomas Brennan, a farmer whose family had lived in the hollow for 3 generations, later told investigators that he'd considered not attending. "Something felt wrong," he said. "Can't explain it proper, but I had this feeling in my gut, like when you know a storm's coming even though the sky is clear. But how do you not go? How do you tell your neighbors, your family, that you're refusing the preacher's invitation? In a place like Redemption Hollow, that's not just rude, it's spiritual rebellion." So they came. All of them came. October 17th, 1897, dawned cold and clear. The sun rose pale and distant, offering little warmth. By late afternoon, as shadows lengthened across the hollow and the temperature began to drop, families emerged from their homes dressed in their Sunday finest clothes that were threadbare and patched but clean, pressed with heated irons, treated with the respect due to sacred occasions. They walked toward the church in small groups, their breath visible in the cooling air. Children ran ahead, excited by the novelty of an evening service, by the promise of a special meal. Mothers carried infants wrapped in quilts. Elderly members of the community moved slowly, supported by younger relatives. determined not to miss what Reverend Cartwright had promised would be a revelation. By 6 o'clock, as twilight settled over the mountains and the first stars appeared in a darkening sky, 143 people had gathered in and around the small white church. Lanterns were lit, casting warm golden light through the windows. The temperature inside rose as bodies filled the space, creating pockets of warmth in the October chill. Reverend Cartwright stood at the front of the church, dressed entirely in black, his face illuminated by candles placed on the altar. Behind him, covered with white cloth, were several large pots and serving dishes. The smell of cooked food filled the air, a rich, savory aroma that made empty stomachs rumble with anticipation. He raised his hands for silence. The congregation settled, the rustle of fabric and whispered conversations fading to expectant quiet. "Brothers and sisters," Cartwright began, his voice low and intimate, "tonight we take a journey together. Tonight we prove our faith not with words but with actions. Tonight we show the Lord that we trust Him absolutely, that we would follow wherever He leads, even into darkness, even into valley deep and terrible, because we know that He awaits us on the other side." The congregation murmured Amen. "This meal before you has been prepared according to divine instruction," he continued, his eyes moving slowly across the faces before him. "Every ingredient, every preparation, exactly as revealed to me. To partake of this food is to enter into covenant with the Almighty. To refuse—" He paused, letting the silence stretch. "To refuse is to declare yourself outside His grace. No one refused. How could they?" Cartwright began distributing the food. Large bowls of stew, thick with vegetables and chunks of meat, bread, fresh, baked and still warm, cups of cider pressed from autumn apples. The congregation ate eagerly, gratefully, filling plates and bellies that had known too much hunger in recent months. The food was delicious, rich and satisfying in a way that felt almost decadent given the community's recent hardships. They ate, they smiled, they felt blessed, they didn't know they were dying. The first symptoms appeared within 20 minutes. Margaret Hollis, a young mother nursing her infant son, felt a sudden wave of nausea. She attributed it to eating too quickly, to the richness of food her stomach wasn't accustomed to processing. She excused herself from the pew, intending to step outside for fresh air. She collapsed before reaching the door. Within moments, others began experiencing similar symptoms: stomach cramps that doubled them over, dizziness that sent them stumbling into pews, burning sensations in their throats and chests, confusion that manifested as slurred speech and disoriented movements. The church descended into chaos. Children began crying, some from their own pain, others from terror at seeing their parents suddenly incapacitated. The elderly, whose systems absorbed the poison more quickly, simply slumped in their seats, eyes rolling back, breath becoming shallow and erratic. Those who remained mobile tried to help, but they too were beginning to feel the effects, their own bodies betraying them. Sarah McKinney, who had eaten only a small portion of the stew before the horror began, watched as the scene transformed from sacred gathering to nightmare. People were everywhere on the floor. She later testified, her voice breaking with remembered trauma. Writhing, vomiting, some just, still, so still, the sounds, dear God, the sounds, moaning and crying and people praying, begging God to save them, not understanding that God hadn't done this. A man had, and that man stood at the front of the church, watching. Reverend Elijah Cartwright remained at the altar, his face serene, his hands folded before him as if in prayer. He did not rush to help. He did not express surprise or horror. He simply observed, his dark eyes moving across the dying congregation, with what witnesses would later describe as satisfaction. Thomas Brennan, fighting through his own growing agony, managed to stumble toward the preacher. What have you done?" he gasped, gripping the altar for support. What was in that food? Cartwright smiled, a small, peaceful smile that held no warmth. "Deliverance," he said simply. "I have delivered you all from the suffering to come. The visions showed me the tribulation awaiting this world, horrors beyond comprehension, pain beyond endurance. But I was given the means to spare my flock, to transport you directly into the Lord's presence, bypassing the agony He revealed to me. You should be grateful, Thomas. You're about to meet your Maker." Brennan lunged at him, but his strength failed. He collapsed at Cartwright's feet, convulsing. The preacher stepped over him and walked calmly toward the door. Outside, the few congregation members who hadn't eaten yet, those who had arrived late or had been standing in the churchyard rather than inside, heard the commotion and rushed toward the building. They found a scene from hell itself, bodies everywhere, people of all ages in various stages of poisoning, some already dead, others dying, a few still conscious and aware enough to understand what was happening to them. The smell of vomit and excrement mixed with the lingering aroma of the poisoned meal. Lanterns had been knocked over in the chaos, creating dangerous pools of spilled oil that threatened fire. And standing just outside the church doors, perfectly calm, was Reverend Cartwright. "Stay back," he commanded when they approached. "This is divine work. Do not interfere with the Lord's plan." But his words no longer held power. The spell was broken. The survivors, perhaps 30 people who had not eaten the poisoned food, stared at him not with devotion, but with dawning horror and rage. Jacob Miller, a blacksmith whose wife and 3 children lay dying inside the church, let out a roar of pure anguish and charged. Others followed. They seized Cartwright, who offered no resistance, dragging him away from the church as others rushed inside to try to save whoever could be saved. A rider was dispatched immediately, sent galloping through the darkness toward the county seat, 15 miles distant. The journey, which normally took 2 hours on mountain roads, was completed in 75 minutes, the horse nearly collapsing from exertion when it reached the sheriff's office. Sheriff William Crenshaw assembled a posse and a doctor, loading wagons with medical supplies and blankets, then made the return journey with all possible speed. They arrived shortly after midnight to find Redemption Hollow transformed into a scene of mourning and death. The church had become a makeshift morgue. Bodies had been laid out in rows, covered with quilts and blankets brought from nearby homes. Women moved among them with candles, identifying the dead, preparing them for burial according to mountain tradition. The sound of weeping filled the air, a collective grief so profound it seemed to make the very mountains tremble. Dr. Harrison Webb, who accompanied Sheriff Crenshaw, moved quickly among the survivors, but his efforts were largely futile. Those who had consumed significant amounts of the poisoned food were beyond medical help. He could only administer morphine to ease their final hours, holding hands and offering whatever comfort was possible. By dawn, 37 people were dead. 12 more would die over the following 3 days, their systems too damaged by the poison to recover. Among the victims, 19 children under the age of 12, 8 women, 20 men ranging in age from 18 to 73. The final death toll reached 49. Reverend Elijah Cartwright sat calmly in the church basement, the only room with a door that could be secured, guarded by men who had lost everything. He refused to speak, refused to explain, refused to show any emotion beyond a mild annoyance at being restrained. When Sheriff Crenshaw finally confronted him, demanding to know what poison had been used so that treatment could be attempted, Cartwright simply smiled. "Arsenic," he said finally, almost casually, mixed into the stew, enough to ensure the journey would be swift for most. I showed mercy, Sheriff, more mercy than this world would have shown them. The investigation that followed revealed the depth of Cartwright's planning. In his cabin, authorities found detailed journals outlining his intentions, his methodology, his theological justifications. He had been acquiring arsenic for months, small amounts purchased from various sources across 3 counties, never enough to raise suspicion, always with plausible explanations about rat infestations or livestock needs. The journals revealed his descent into what authorities could only describe as messianic delusion. He wrote of visions that became increasingly apocalyptic, of conversations with what he believed were angels, of a growing conviction that he alone had been chosen to spare the faithful from horrors ahead. The writings suggested someone whose grip on reality had completely severed, replaced by a certainty so absolute it overrode all moral constraints. Most chilling were the entries from the days immediately preceding the mass poisoning. He wrote with anticipation, almost joy, about the deliverance he would soon provide. He expressed no doubt, no hesitation, no recognition that what he planned was murder on a massive scale. The final entry, dated October 16th, the day before the poisoning, contained a single sentence: "Tomorrow, I prove my love for them." The trial of Elijah Cartwright began on December 1st, 1897, in the Henderson County Courthouse. The proceeding lasted only 3 days. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence: the journals, testimony from survivors, chemical analysis of the remaining food that confirmed lethal amounts of arsenic, and Cartwright's own confession. The defense, a court-appointed attorney who clearly found his client's actions indefensible, attempted to argue insanity, to suggest that Cartwright's delusions rendered him incapable of understanding his actions. The jury deliberated for 47 minutes, guilty on 49 counts of first-degree murder. Judge Harrison Blackwell, a stern man who had presided over the county court for 23 years, delivered the sentence with visible emotion. "Mr. Cartwright," he said, his voice steady but strained, "you have committed an act of such profound evil, such calculated malevolence, that I find myself without adequate words to express the revulsion this court feels toward you and your actions. You exploited the trust of good people, their faith in God and in you as His representative, to commit mass murder. The law permits me only one sentence for such crimes: a death by hanging." The execution was scheduled for March 23, 1898. Throughout the trial and the months of waiting, Cartwright maintained his composure. He showed no remorse, no fear, no acknowledgement that his actions had been anything other than divinely mandated. He spent his final months reading scripture, writing letters to newspapers claiming his actions would be vindicated by history, and predicting that the apocalypse he'd foreseen would arrive within the year. It didn't. The world continued, indifferent to his prophecies. On the morning of his execution, Cartwright walked to the gallows erected in the courthouse square with his head held high. A crowd of over 2,000 people had gathered: survivors from Redemption Hollow, relatives of victims from across the state, curious onlookers drawn by the sensational nature of the case, and reporters from as far away as Chicago and New York. Sheriff Crenshaw read the death warrant. A minister, not from Cartwright's denomination, offered prayers for the souls of the victims. Cartwright was asked if he had any final words. He did. "The Lord's plan is not for man to question," he proclaimed, his voice carrying across the square. "What I did in obedience to a higher authority than this court, than this government, than any earthly power. You execute me today believing you serve justice, but you simply remove one instrument of divine will. The tribulation I foresaw approaches still. You'll remember my name when the trapdoor opened. Elijah Cartwright fell. His neck snapped cleanly. Death was instantaneous. The crowd stood in silence for several moments, processing what they'd witnessed. Then, slowly, people began to disperse, returning to lives forever altered by the events in Redemption Hollow. In the aftermath, Redemption Hollow ceased to exist. The survivors, those who had lost children, spouses, parents, siblings, could not remain in a place so thoroughly soaked in tragedy. Within a year, every family had relocated. Some moved to other parts of Kentucky, others left the state entirely, seeking to escape the memories that haunted every familiar landmark. The church was torn down, its lumber scattered or burned. The town itself gradually disappeared as nature reclaimed the hollow. Buildings collapsed, roads grew over with vegetation, and the forest moved in to erase evidence of human habitation. By 1900, only 4 years after the massacre, Redemption Hollow existed only in county records and in the nightmares of those who survived. The location was eventually renamed Morgan's Gap, the original name lost to deliberate forgetting. Visitors to the area today find no markers, no monuments, no indication that 49 people died here in an act of faith-based murder that shocked the nation. But the story endures. Historians who study American religious extremism inevitably encounter Elijah Cartwright. Psychologists examining messianic delusion and charismatic manipulation reference his case. True crime enthusiasts researching mass murders cite Redemption Hollow as one of the earliest documented instances of faith-based mass killing in United States history. The victims' names are recorded in Henderson County death records, though many of the graves themselves have been lost to time, relocated by surviving family members, or simply abandoned in now inaccessible family plots deep in the mountains. Questions remain. How did no one recognize the signs of Cartwright's growing delusion? Were there warning indicators that the community, so insulated and so trusting, simply failed to perceive? Could intervention have prevented the tragedy, or was Cartwright so convinced of his divine mandate that nothing could have deterred him? We'll never know with certainty. What we do know is that faith, when unchecked by reason, when concentrated through the lens of a disturbed mind, when accepted without question by those desperate for meaning and guidance, can become the most dangerous force imaginable. The story of Reverend Elijah Cartwright and the congregation he murdered remains a disturbing reminder that trust must be tempered with discernment, that devotion should never mean abandoning critical thought, and that those who claim to speak for God must be held to the highest standards of moral accountability. To this day, elderly residents of what's now called Morgan's Gap region report strange occurrences on October 17th. Lights in the forest where the old church once stood. The sound of hymns carried on the wind when no services are being held anywhere nearby. A sense of profound sadness that settles over the hollow as evening approaches. Some dismiss these reports as superstition, as the power of suggestion acting on people who know the history. Others believe that places where great suffering occurred retain an imprint, an echo of anguish that can never be fully erased. And on autumn nights, when fog rolls through the valleys and obscures the mountain peaks, when the temperature drops and the forest falls silent, people walking the old trails through Morgan's Gap report feeling watched, not by anything malevolent necessarily, but by something sorrowful, by presence that carry grief that can never be relieved. The memory of 49 souls who died believing they were about to meet their God, only to discover that they had met their murderer instead. If this journey through one of America's darkest chapters of religious manipulation and mass murder has resonated with you, if you find yourself pondering the dangerous intersection of faith and fanaticism, then consider subscribing to this channel. There are many more stories waiting to be told, mysteries buried in time that deserve to be examined with the seriousness they demand. Leave a like if this account provoked reflections that go beyond mere entertainment, and comment sharing your own perspectives on where the line exists between devoted faith and dangerous delusion. Until next time, remember that the past speaks to us across the years, offering lessons we ignore at our peril. The untold hour will return,